We're going to take a look at the Crusades as a defining moment in life during the late Middle Ages in Europe. Also, it had a dramatic impact on the other peoples of the Middle East that the Crusaders had contact with. Let's start with a basic overview of what the Crusades were really about. To begin with, the Seljuk Turks had threatened the Byzantine Empire. In 1093, the Byzantine Emperor, Alexis Comnenus, asked Pope Urban II in Rome for help. This was kind of unusual that the Byzantine Emperor would actually ask the Pope in Rome for help. So this was an unusual event for him to do that. In 1095, the Council of Clermont called for a crusade to recapture Jerusalem. And so again, the Pope, not quite sure what he should do, called the Council of Clermont, and the decision was that in order to help the Byzantine Empire, they had to recapture the city of Jerusalem. So that was declared in 1095. So what we're going to look at then is a series of what caused the Crusades and sort of a timeline of the Crusades. So we're going to start off with 1096 to 1099. That's the years of the First Crusade. All right, now, for those of you in my class taking notes, I want you to record the notes that are in yellow. You don't need to record all the notes that are here, but just the things that are highlighted in yellow. So in 1096 to 1099 is the dates of the First Crusade, and it was motivated by the occupation of Jerusalem by Seljuk Turks. Okay? Now, this First Crusade was led by Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Peter the Hermit. Now, they captured Jerusalem, so this First Crusade was actually successful. It took a few years to get there, but they actually captured Jerusalem. The problem was it was accompanied by looting and massacre. So this is one of the negative histories about the First Crusade, is that when the Christians finally got to Jerusalem, Jerusalem was occupied by some Christians, but Muslims and Jews. And there wasn't a lot of distinction amongst people, but when the Christians showed up, they tended to slaughter people. They killed men, women, children, old folks. They really just killed many people. And so that was what defined the First Crusade. And so a number of small Crusader states were also established along the Syrian coast. So as a result of this, the First Crusade was seen as a success because people were motivated by religion. The Crusaders thought they were going there to express their Christian views and save Jerusalem, take it back from the Muslims. But the kinds of acts that they conducted when they got there were reprehensible and, of course, included things like looting and massacre. Okay, then there was the Second Crusade. So let's record the yellow stuff here. We've got 1147 to 49. This one failed to capture Damascus and Edessa. These were two major cities located in that region. Now, this one was led by Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III. So in this case, we have more powerful, influential people leading these crusades. But this crusade was not a success. And part of that may have been their reasons for going on the crusade. And also, you should pay attention to the dates, because this crusade comes at a much later time period. Now, we also know that Jerusalem would then be seized by Saladin in 1187. Now, who was Saladin? Saladin was the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, and he was the leader of the Muslims against the Crusaders. Now, people in the West, people in America and Europe, might not be familiar with who Saladin is, but young people growing up in the Middle East know exactly who he is. Basically, he is seen as a hero and a defender of Islam and Arab peoples living in the Middle East against the Christian Crusaders. Keep in mind, from the perspective of Crusaders, they believed themselves to be acting on behalf of God. But from the perspective of Muslims living in the Middle East, the Crusaders were murderers and massacres. They came in and they killed people, and that was seen as a negative thing. So this is going to change people's point of view depending on whether you are a Christian European or whether you are Islamic Middle Easterner. Basically, they would see these events from two very different perspectives. So then there's the Third Crusade. That's 1189 to 92. And this one was led by Philip II Augustus of France and Richard the Lionheart of England. This one did not go well either. It failed to recapture Jerusalem. And in fact, Richard I was actually captured and held it for ransom for a while. If you're wondering who Richard the Lionheart is, Richard I the Lionheart is the King of England. And he's the king who's missing in the story that we know from Robin Hood. When Robin Hood is in England and he's going against Prince John and he's stealing from the rich to give to the poor, he's waiting for the king to come back and restore honor. It's Richard the First that he's waiting for. Okay, so that's a story that, although mythical in its tale, has some basis in the history of the fact that Richard the First actually went on a crusade and was actually captured and held ransom for some time. All right, here's the Fourth Crusade. Again, yellow stuff we want to write down. 1202 to 1204. This one was actually diverted from Jerusalem by its Venetian financial backers to sack and divide Constantinople. Now, this was led by William of Monferrata and Baldwin of Hainault. This is really interesting because remember, if you go back to the First Crusade, the reason there was a crusade is that the Byzantine emperor had actually called for help from the Pope and asked that they come and help them. And so by the time you get to 1202, the Fourth Crusade, now the Crusaders aren't going to Jerusalem. They literally turned their boats and went to Constantinople instead and sacked Constantinople. Now why this is weird is because these are Christians. These are Christians going to a Byzantine, Eastern Christian capital and killing other Christians to take the loot. And so, again, the Fourth Crusade is very different than the First Crusade because the First Crusade was about religion. But by the time you get to the Fourth Crusade, it's really about money. It's really about, basically going to another place and stealing as much as you can. And of course, in this case, the Venetian financial backers helped to bring lots of stuff back to Venice. And as a result, there's still lots of statues and wealth and interesting artifacts that can be found in Venice today that have their origins in Constantinople. They were stolen. All right, this list can keep going on. We have the Children's Crusade, which took place in 1212, in which thousands of children crossed Europe on their way to Palestine, but many of them ended up being sold into slavery in Marseille or died of disease and hunger. So there's some mythical tales to this crusade as well, but essentially children were told to go off on a crusade to fight, but they were essentially enslaved, and none of them, or very few of them, would have ever made it on the crusade. So this one was not a success either. And then there's the Fifth Crusade from 1218 to 1221, and this was led by King Andrew of Hungary, Cardinal Pelagius, King John of Jerusalem, and King Hugh of Cyprus. They captured, but then they lost Dalmatia in Egypt. So this one also didn't meet with success or long-term success. Then there was the Sixth Crusade, and this was 1228 to 1229, and this was led by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. In this case, Jerusalem was recovered by negotiation with the Sultan of Egypt. So essentially, they purchased it. They bought their way into Jerusalem, which is very interesting because it was a very different approach to how the Crusades would have been fought in earlier decades. Okay, and then 1244, Jerusalem was finally lost, and it would remain in Turkish hands until it was liberated by the British General Allenby in 1917. So Jerusalem was basically an Islamic city from 1244 until 1917. Right? Okay, and then we have the Seventh Crusade, actually. 1249 to 1254 was led by Louis IX of France. This one was not successful in any way. And then the Eighth Crusade from 1270 to 1272 was also led by Louis IX of France. Again, two-time loser. Wasn't able to do much. And then Accra, a city that was in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, falls to the Turks, and did that in 1291. And it was the last Christian fortress in Syria. So of all the Christian sort of fortresses that had been built in Syria, this would be the last one to fall in 1291. And that was marked the end of crusading and Christians showing up in the Middle East. All right, let's take a look at this interactive map of the Crusades from 1096 to 1024. I'm going to start by clicking this first part of the key that shows the Christian lands in sort of pink. And those are all areas that would have been controlled by both the Roman Catholics and also the Eastern Byzantine Christians. Now the next part of the key is yellow, and that's the Muslim lands. And you can see that the Muslims control most of what we call the Middle East, North Africa, and even southern Spain. And now I'm going to click the next part in the key, which is this purple area, and these are kingdoms that were established by the Crusaders. And you can see they're all located on the Eastern Mediterranean and include even Jerusalem. So let's take a look then at the First Crusade and how that went. The First Crusade started in 1096 and went to 1099, and you can see it starts in 2 or 3 locations in Central Europe. And one route they go across Italy, and in the other they go through what we would call Central Germany, and they go to Constantinople. And then from there, they make their way by land to Edessa, Antioch, and eventually Jerusalem, which they actually capture. So the First Crusade was a success because they actually captured Jerusalem. Now let's take a look at the Second Crusade. This one goes from 1147 to 1149, and it starts in central France, and it makes its way through what we would call Germany, goes to Constantinople, and then by boat it tries to make its way to Antioch, Tripoli, Acre, and then Jerusalem. But this crusade was actually a failure. It did not capture Jerusalem. Now let's take a look at the Third Crusade. This one goes from 1189 to 1191, and you can see it's coming from different locations. It's coming from across the English Channel, and it's going all the way around Spain. It's also coming through central France. It's also coming through central Germany. And all of these routes eventually make their way towards what we call Acre, but they did not get to Jerusalem, and this crusade was not a success. Now, the Fourth Crusade. This one goes from 1202 to 1204. It starts in Venice. It goes around Greece, and then it takes a sharp turn and goes directly to Constantinople. And this is an interesting crusade because they were supposed to go capture Jerusalem, but the Venetian financial backers of this crusade, the guys who were paying for it, decided that Constantinople was the more wealthier place to go. And as a result, they diverted the crusade to Constantinople, and they attacked it and they looted it. Now, why this is ironic is because these are basically Roman Catholics, Christians, going to Constantinople and killing other Christians. They're Byzantine Christians. So it's ironic because the purpose of the Crusades in the first place was to go capture Jerusalem from Muslims. And in this case, by the Fourth Crusade, you've got Christians killing other Christians. So the First Crusade started off as a religious reason, but when you get to the Fourth Crusade, you begin to see that these crusades are really about money and wealth and power and politics, not so much about religion anymore. So the Crusades changed over time. And if you pay attention to those dates, you'll notice that there's large gaps between each crusade. So if I show you everything on the map, you can now see the overlapping routes of the crusades, but also keep in mind that this took place over several generations. And if I include the crusades that came after the Fourth Crusade, you'd also see that there were different reasons for why people went. So they started off for religious reasons, but in the end, the last few crusades were really not about religion. They were really about wealth and power. Here you can see what the Crusader states looked like that were set up as a result of the Crusades, particularly the First Crusades. So you had the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, the country of Tripolis, Principality of Antioch, and the county of Edessa. So all of these, you can see, are located along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. And these were regions that did not go too far inland. They stayed mostly coastal, and they did not control all of these regions. So it was very difficult for the Crusaders to control these regions, primarily because they weren't from that region. They were considered outsiders, foreigners who had invaded their land. Now, this is an example of a fortress that would be built by Crusaders. There are still many of these standing in Syria. And what's interesting about this fortress, as you can see, I mean, it looks like a castle. It looks like a medieval castle. It's up on a hill. It's up on a bluff. But this is how the Crusaders conducted themselves during the Crusades. They stayed in fortresses not only to protect themselves, but also that what they would do is they would leave these fortresses and go out and essentially raid the countryside. They would take from the local peasants. They would take from the local people. They would loot. They would, cause mayhem, destruction, maybe even kill people. And then they would take their loot and they would go back into the castle, into their fortress. And they would come out when they needed to impose their rule or impose their law or take what they needed, and then they would go back to their castle. So this is the kind of behavior that doesn't make for good government. A government that basically lives in a fortress and only comes out to take what it needs and exploit the local population is not one that's going to be loved by the local people. Most of the local people in this case were Muslims who felt like they were being oppressed by foreign invaders who had set up a fortress in their home. So you can understand why, in this case, Syrians or people of Islamic descent would not look kindly upon the Crusaders. It was not seen as a positive experience for them. So some people have argued that there actually has been a 10th crusade, and the year 2003 comes to mind when they bring this up. So for instance, here's a quote. It says, This is a new kind of evil, and we understand, and the American people are beginning to understand, this crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while. And that was said on September 16th, 2001 by President Bush. Now, this picture that I've just shown you is not something that I created, but it was something I very easily found on the internet. And what it shows is that there are people on the internet who clearly do not like George Bush. And in this case, they portrayed him as a crusader. Now, what's interesting about this is that George Bush made a huge mistake in this quote. He used a loaded word. The word that he used that was loaded was crusade. And that word has a very different meaning to Muslims than it does to people who are of European descent. So to a Christian, crusade might mean a challenge to overcome or an obstacle to overcome. But to Muslims, the word crusade means Christians are going to come to Jerusalem and kill us. And so it's a very different perspective. And George Bush should have been more sensitive about this. This is a word that's loaded. It's a word that means different things to different people. And when he made this quote and he used the word crusade, there were people in the Middle East that heard a very different thing. They didn't hear that they were going to overcome terrorism. They heard, oh, crusade means that we're going to be invaded and people are going to come here and kill us. So it's a word that can have many different meanings for different people depending on their perspective. This is why we need to be careful about what kinds of vocabulary we use when talking about politics. So again, knowing history, studying history, understanding that different cultures have different perspectives on different kinds of words that are used in their historical context can maybe help us to understand those people a little bit better. All right then, let's take a quick look at the causes and effects of the Crusades. Here's the causes. Muslims controlled the Holy Land and threatened Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor calls for help. The Pope appeals to Christian knights. Knights feel religious zeal and want land, riches, and adventure. And Italian cities desired commercial power. So these are the major causes for the outbreak of the Crusades. And you can see there is no one single cause. There were many factors that contributed to why people went on crusades. So what are the effects? Here are the effects. Let's start off with the Byzantine Empire was weakened. So we know that as a result, even though they called for help, by the end of the Crusades, the Byzantine Empire was weakened to the point that it collapsed. Also, the Pope's power declines, because at the beginning of the Crusades, he could call the Crusades, but by the end of the Crusades, people weren't going for just religious reasons. In fact, people were now going on the Crusades and not staying where they were supposed to, back home on the manors. So that also weakened the power of the feudal nobles, because all of a sudden, people were leaving the manor and going to faraway places where they hadn't done this before. Also, the kings became stronger. As you see in many of the later Crusades, the kings used the Crusades as a means by which they could go on a crusade, which would make them more powerful than the Pope. Also, religious intolerance grows. So obviously Christians and Muslims were killing each other during this time period, and Jews were sort of stuck in between because they lived in both places. Also, the Italian cities expanded trade and grew rich. So one of the benefits, if you could say there was benefits from the Crusade, is that people from Europe actually went to other parts of the world they hadn't been before. And they saw that life in the Middle East was actually pretty good. Remember, Islam was still in the sort of ending period of its golden age, but there was wealth, and there was literacy and knowledge, and people in Europe began to see that. And as they went back from the Crusades, they wanted access to more of those goods and that kind of knowledge. And so again, it expanded trade, and people in Europe began to grow wealthy, particularly the Italian cities, because they were located centrally in the middle of the Mediterranean. Also, Muslims began to distrust Christians. If you want to understand why it is that many Muslims today don't like Christians, Europeans, or Americans, it can be dated back to the Crusades. Remember, the word crusade is a loaded word. To Christians, it might mean an obstacle to overcome or a challenge to face, but to Muslims, the word crusade means that Christians are going to show up and kill them, like they did when they first entered Jerusalem during the First Crusade. So the beginnings of mistrust for Muslims and Christians dates all the way back to the Crusades. Now, also, trade grows between Europe and Asia. As we said, as the Italian cities became more wealthy, more goods from the Middle East and Asia began to flow freely into Europe. As the Dark Ages came to an end in Europe, people wanted more goods. They wanted more things like from silks and spices and things that came from Asia, and that continued to increase trade and improve life in Europe as well. And then Europeans adopt Muslim technology. So one of the things that Europeans learned from their conquests of the Islamic world, particularly by getting access to books, was they learned things about technology and science. Many of those books would then be translated and would go on to help Europeans later on make some of the great discoveries that they were able to in math and science.